In the 70s and 80s, Britain was in a strange situation. Millions of people went about their daily lives as if nothing was amiss. But in the back of everyone's mind was the real possibility that a nuclear attack could come at any moment. Cold War tensions around the globe made things uncertain, and governments had to plan for the worst case scenario. What if we come under attack? Civilians needed to know what to do if an attack came, and so the government created a public information campaign intended to do just that. What they were not prepared for was how insensitive and dehumanising those efforts would be perceived by the public, and how extensively ridiculed the campaign would become.
Protect and Survive was a UK government public information campaign about what civilians should do in the event of nuclear attack. It was created in the mid to late 1970s by the Central Office of Information for the Home Office, and it included short animated films, emergency radio broadcasts, press announcements, and a booklet intended in an emergency to be distributed to every household in the country. The booklet itself was first produced around 1975, then reprinted for wider circulation in May 1980. The campaign was not originally intended for immediate release and ordinary public scrutiny. It was to be activated only if nuclear attack seemed imminent, with the films broadcast if attack was thought to be likely within 72 hours. Protect and Survive was the government's public-facing answer to the question of whether nuclear war was going to be survivable. It offered supposedly practical advice, but when it became public, it also exposed the reality of what civilians might actually face after a nuclear strike.
The most recognisable elements of the campaign were the informational films and the booklet, which outlined the same advice. We'll be taking an in-depth look at both in this video to help us understand why Protect and Survive was created and how a set of supposedly practical instructions became so controversial. Protect and Survive was intended to only be released to the public in case of an imminent nuclear attack. Then the films would be broadcast on television and the booklets would be distributed nationwide. The information gave the public detailed steps that they should take to have the best chance surviving a nuclear strike. But through a series of leaks and political pressure, the advice was eventually made publicly available despite no nuclear attacks being anticipated. And this fact changed everything.
This is a 1975 copy of the booklet Protect and Survive, produced by the Central Office of Information for the Home Office. It was intended to be advice for the householder from the government to help people protect their families and to survive what was to come. It briefly outlines the three main challenges to survival following a nuclear explosion: heat, blast, and radioactive fallout, before laying out a survival plan. It ends with a handy action checklist.
Protect and Survive came during a period when nuclear defence was a major political issue. The Home Office had decided in 1974 that it needed to address what civilians should do in the event of a nuclear attack. The campaign was commissioned in October 1975, with the official brief imagining a deteriorating international situation and the possible release of survival information by the government of the day. By the time the campaign became public in 1980, the wider context had become even more tense. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Euro missile crisis, NATO plans for cruise and Pershing missiles in Western Europe, and the revival of anti-nuclear protests all fed a renewed sense of nuclear anxiety. For many people, nuclear war no longer felt like a distant possibility.
The government wanted people to stay at home, keep calm and prepare. That was the central message of Protect and Survive. If people remained in their own homes rather than fleeing, the situation would likely be easier to contain, as there was no extensive system of communal shelters or mass evacuation plan ready to protect the population instead. The campaign asked people to believe that there were practical steps they could take to reduce danger and increase their chances of survival.
The most widespread danger from nuclear explosions is fallout. Fallout is dust that is sucked up from the ground by the explosion. Fallout can kill. Since it can be carried for great distances by the winds, it can eventually settle anywhere. So you are just as safe in your own home area as anywhere else. In fact, you are far better off at home.
Protect and Survive wants to invoke an orderly air of keep calm and carry on. On the front cover we see the so-called nuclear family, also featured in the animated films. The first page makes the striking claim, read this booklet with care, your life and the lives of your family may depend upon it. If you move away, the authority in your new area will not help you if you leave. Your local authority may need to take your empty house for others to use. This kind of advice was intentionally a world away from any sense of chaos, panic, looting, fleeing, leading up to any attack. Protect and Survive's purpose was to recommend restraint. Its intent was probably social control. If people stayed at home, efforts could otherwise focus upon the transition to war. Home is at least visually depicted in the booklet as quite suburban, middle class, roomy, perhaps with a garden. Unfortunately, if you live in a block of flats of over 5 floors, you're told you shouldn't stay in the top 2 stories. The advice is make alternative arrangements. Not great news either if you live in a bungalow, which you're told wouldn't give you much protection.
When you have used the bucket lavatory, wipe your hands with toilet paper soaked in a little mild disinfectant. Throw the paper into the container and put the lid on. Keep an eye on small children and see that they do the same as you to keep clean.
That's what the public was expected to do, but who was in charge of warning them of an impending strike?
I'm standing in a section of the galleries at IWM London called Shadow of the Bomb. Behind me are a group of objects which would have been used to warn people and gather information if Britain had come under nuclear attack during the Cold War. The Protect and Survive campaign alludes to some of this. It details the sirens people might expect to hear. But when you see these objects brought to life from the pages of public information booklets, it really brings home the fact that nuclear war was a real possibility, and that for several decades, some people were actively preparing and training for the day it might come. The United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation and the Royal Observer Corps were left with the task of warning the nation in the event of a nuclear strike. This warning equipment was located in a Kent police station from 1963 until 1985, and it formed part of the civil defence system used for activating air raid sirens and notifying warning posts of a potential nuclear strike during the Cold War. The handle warning message of a nuclear attack would have been received from the UK Warning and Monitoring Organisation on one of the 2 handsets, here bound with red tape. Then the duty operator would have pressed the red siren control button. This would have set off an electrically powered siren above the police station, one of around 7,000 spread around the country. Once alerted to a nuclear attack, regional control points across Britain would have mobilised a further 11,000 local warning posts. Manned voluntarily by members of the Royal Observer Corps, they would have ensured that the nuclear attack warning was heard across the whole nation, using equipment such as this portable hand-operated siren. Information about potentially deadly nuclear fallout would have been gathered by the hundreds of monitoring posts across the country and sent to 25 group control centres. Plotting the spread on maps, these centres would then have updated the monitoring posts to show the drift of radiation across the country. If fallout approached these areas, the monitoring posts would then have sounded fresh public warnings by firing rockets or maroons like these, which come from this maroon firing training kit, complete with instructions. The personnel who would have been expected to use these would have been very familiar with the setup though, since they carried out regular training drills.
Public information to help survive a nuclear attack was nothing new. While Protect and Survive has gone down as the best known collection of public information on the subject, it was part of a much longer history of civil defence advice. From the 1950s onwards, government booklets and leaflets had tried to explain what nuclear war might mean for ordinary people and what they could do to prepare for it.
These objects are a group of civil defence documents from the 50s through to the 80s. They include a 1950s COI booklet asking whether civil defence was any use in the nuclear age, a 1963 handbook on advising householders against nuclear attack, and a 1981 Home Office Guide to Building Your Own Domestic Nuclear Shelters, as well as our 1975 copy of Protect and Survive. Together, they show that Protect and Survive was part of a much longer tradition of official nuclear advice. What is striking is how much continuity there is. The same core ideas come back again and again. The dangers of heat, blast and fallout, warning systems, a refuge inside the home, emergency supplies, and the need to endure. The earlier material often gives a stronger sense of civil defence organisations, emergency services and community action outside the home. By contrast, Protect and Survive feels more isolated and so claustrophobic because by the 1980s, much of that wider civil defence framework had been stripped back. It's quite remarkable that this 1960s handbook, which contains so much of the same advice as Protect and Survive, also caused a lot of upset when it was released. But most people have never heard of it. Like Protect and Survive, it was produced for the Home Office as part of a COI public information campaign, and it was similarly accompanied by public information films. It also emerged at a moment of heightened nuclear anxieties in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like its 1980s counterpart, the advice drew criticism. There were voices within the House of Commons calling for this to be withdrawn, some dismissing it as not worth the 9p it was sold for. The leaflets show both change and remarkable continuity. Across several decades, official advice kept returning back to the same basic problems: how to warn people, how to shelter from fallout, how to prepare supplies, and how to protect the home.
One key element of Protect and Survive that people took issue with was the tone of voice used in the films and the booklet. The language of the campaign was calm, factual, and instructional. But that's what made it so unsettling.
Some of the advice was received with responses ranging from bemusement to horror, because it placed ordinary household tasks beside the prospect of nuclear war. Removing net curtains, painting windows with light emulsion, storing sand to clean plates, making improvised toilets and labelling the dead are all presented in the same practical register. The use of stark instructional language may have made the booklet clear, but it also made it feel chillingly detached from the trauma of events it was asking people to imagine.
If anyone dies while you are kept in your fallout room, move the body to another room in the house. Label the body with name and address, and cover it as tightly as possible in polythene, paper, sheets or blankets. Tie a second card to the covering. The radio will advise you what to do about taking the body away for burial.
It's easy to understand why so many people took issue with the tone of this advice. However, it's important to remember that this advice was never meant to be publicly available in peacetime. It was only supposed to be broadcast and distributed in the worst case scenario. The films and radio material were classified, but they were not especially well hidden, and in March 1980 they were leaked to the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and the BBC. There was so much public, parliamentary and media interest that the Thatcher government released the booklet in May 1980, and once it was in the public domain, it became the focal point for criticism. Some thought that the advice was futile. Others were alarmed that the government seemed to be presenting nuclear war as something that people could survive. A key issue was that the advice was just not realistic. When it was written, it was intended to only be distributed in the 72 hours preceding an attack. But when viewed in the context of a general release to the public, as ended up happening, it became much harder to take the advice seriously. One film recommends keeping 7 gallons of water per person on hand in the house. For a family of 4, that would mean keeping 28 gallons of water continually stored in the home in case an attack were to take place.
Well, each person should drink about 2 pints a day. So, for 14 days, 3.5 gallons is enough for one person. But you should double this amount if you can. Then there will be some to spare for washing your face and hands. Keep drinking water in your fallout room.
Could this kind of advice actually save lives? Assuming people had the ability to follow it, they would have to have survived the initial strike to begin with.
Protect and Survive would have been of no use to people at the centre of a direct thermonuclear strike where the destruction and death toll would have been devastating. But the booklet sidesteps that fact. It also assumed that there would be time to prepare, that people would remain calm, and that they could safely shelter in their homes with their families for up to 14 days. At the same time, defenders of the advice argued some of it was not entirely futile. If someone was far enough from the detonation, and depending on the scale of the attack, then sheltering from fallout and keeping emergency supplies to sustain a prolonged period indoors might offer some protection. The problem was that the campaign was trying to make practical sense of something almost unimaginable. It dealt with survival in the most basic terms, whilst leaving out the psychological trauma and ignoring completely the question of what life would look like afterwards.
Protect and Survive boiled down the threat of nuclear attack into a booklet, a set of films, a series of instructions, and a household routine. Its popularity in the early 80s was enormous, but perhaps not for the reason the government had hoped. The debate around it quickly became a central talking point in popular culture. CND saw a resurgence, and the phrase Protect and Survive was answered by Protest and Survive. The campaign was mocked, quoted and reworked in music, television, art and print. It became one of the most recognisable symbols of Britain's nuclear anxiety in the early 1980s.
This is a work of art entitled Protect and Survive, Target London 6. It is one of a set of posters on civil defence in London created in the 1980s by British contemporary artist Peter Kennard. It directly references the Protect and Survive advice, the direct quote, "Don't forget to take this booklet with you," in alarming yellow, powerfully juxtaposed against the otherwise very dark image of the skeleton holding the booklet. Peter Kennard's poster is powerful because it answers the official campaign in its own visual language. Protect and Survive presented nuclear advice as calm, practical and manageable. Kennard takes that same booklet and places it in the hands of a skeleton, turning the government's message into something bleak. Like much of Kennard's work, the poster is intended to stop the viewer and make them confront the consequences of nuclear weapons. It ridicules the advice by suggesting that, in practice, the advice within the booklet would offer no real protection. The poster expresses cynicism about the idea that civilians could be meaningfully protected by a government booklet.
Finally, don't forget your booklet, Protect and Survive. It tells you how to make your home and family as safe as possible.
Whilst the threat of nuclear attack still exists today, it's nowhere near as prominent in people's minds as it was in the 1980s. Governments, since the release of Protect and Survive, have continued emergency planning, but largely avoided issuing nuclear advice to British citizens. The lesson seemingly learned, the advice offered in Protect and Survive had backfired.
It was meant to help people feel prepared, but for many it made the reality of nuclear war feel more horrifying because it turns the nuclear arms race into something relatable and human. A family in a room, waiting, with no certainty that anyone is coming to help.
Looking back, Protect and Survive is the perfect example of the difficulties of official reassurance. We'll never know if the campaign would have made a difference because it fortunately never had to be used as intended. Then, after its worldwide public release, the context around it changed everything. A campaign that tried to make a nuclear attack seem survivable instead revealed just how futile government advice would be in the event of a full-scale nuclear war.